So this is going to be a very conceptual talk. Forgive me if you're expecting much data. My heart skipped a beat slightly when Robin, in his excellent talk, assumed that you probably were fairly familiar with hierarchical predictive processing, because if you are, you may as well just get your iPads and laptops out now, because I was going to try and take people through it on the assumption that it wasn't that familiar to most. Forgive me if it is. Naturally, if I inadvertently give the impression that these are my own original thoughts, or that there's much of my own intellect's gone into this, just remember this slide. There are lots of people who have been a huge part of this work. I don't have time to mention them all. I'm going to talk largely about hallucinations, and they come in many forms and with many distinct, separable underlying mechanisms, I believe, although these are often very, very unclear. In one of his Rougon Macquart novels, Émile Zola gave a perfect description of the visual hallucinations, hideous and mutating, that occur with delirium tremens in the unfortunate Rufer Coupeau. Siegfried Sassoon, as a consequence of his traumatic experiences in the First World War, and like many of his contemporaries, suffered from profound hallucinations, here beautifully documented in Pat Barker's excellent book, Regeneration. The Charles Bonnet syndrome is an instance where, as a consequence of deterioration in low-level visual processing, quite well-formed and elaborate and vivid hallucinations occur, although in this case it's quite striking that the person experiencing them retains a good degree of insight into the fact that they are indeed hallucinations. And Philip K. Dick, the visionary science fiction writer who suffered his own periods of severe mental breakdown, was no stranger to experiencing visions and voices and all sorts of departures from objective reality. They come in many forms and with many different causes. And the challenge for me, I think, as a neuropsychiatrist, for us, is not really to find the hallucination center of the brain, the ultimate cause of hallucinations. I think that's a misplaced quest. I think our challenge is to provide explanations of hallucinations that can include the brain and bring real explanatory value and close what we often refer to as this explanatory gap between brain, behavior, and subjective experience. But avoid an unreflective and a sort of automated reductionism with all of its attendant pitfalls, and to give insights into how superficially quite similar phenomena, such as hallucinations, can emerge from distinct causal pathways. Now, the explanatory gap, really this was instilled in me, tattooed on my brain at an early stage by my mentor, Chris Frith, who often used to say, so what? When you do functional imaging and you find a region of the brain that happens to correlate with particular phenomena, subjective experiences, in what way does that constitute an explanation? It's a correlation. It may be a cause, it may be a consequence, it may be a compensation for the phenomena, but in and of itself it brings very little to bear in terms of the search for explanations. I think that the challenge here is to not to put aside things like functional imaging, but to look at these phenomena and these correlations within a framework of an agent that's trying to make sense of a world through a process of interaction and updating, that's trying to build a model of the world based on signals that are ambiguous, delayed, computationally very intensive. Ultimately, I think a brain-based account of hallucinations has to go outside the brain, essentially. So the overview of this presentation, I want to introduce this notion of predictive processing, which I see as a very useful framework. It's very rudimentary at the current stage. I think you could be forgiven for thinking that it's very mature when you read some of the claims made on its behalf, but it's actually rudimentary, albeit increasingly influential, I think, within the field of brain-based biological psychiatry. I think it does promise us some things. It promises us some links to brain processes. But my view is that it's not brain-centric. It doesn't attribute primacy to the brain. And I want to unpack that idea. So I'll outline the core principles of predictive processing, which I think central to which are the idea that the brain is striving to be a model of its world. That inferences are what it must achieve based on an integration of expectation and current input, which Robin nicely alluded to earlier. And I think the challenge that it faces is to achieve a balance based on minimizing a signal that it's wrong, a prediction error signal within a hierarchical system. And I hope that by the end of the talk I'll have made clear what I mean by those slightly arcane assertions. And I think that what happens is that this system, if it does in some ways approximate how the brain interacts with the world, naturally confers certain vulnerabilities upon us to varying degrees in varying circumstances. These might be biases, illusions, and hallucinations. At the roots of predictive processing, and it's often unacknowledged, I think, are a number of major contributions in science in the early 20th century, from cybernetics, information processing theory, and telecommunications. And I think cybernetics, it's worth going back to that literature. Cybernetics refers to the science of control and communication, but I actually see it as the science of interaction between an agent and its world. And the term actually derives from the Greek for steersman, and I think that captures very nicely this idea of a dynamically acting agent responding to the perturbations in its environment, the winds, the tides, the breezes, and so forth, in order to maintain its course as far as it can, or to adjust its course when that becomes necessary. And one of the key figures for me in cybernetics was Ross Ashby, who was actually a psychiatrist. And he formulated, among other things, the good regulator theorem, a beautiful paper in 1970 in which he suggested that for an agent to be a regulator of its environment, which is what cybernetics captures, it has to become a model of that environment. And there's the lovely phrase in the abstract: the theorem has the interesting corollary that the living brain, so far as it is to be successful, must proceed by the formation of a model or models of its environment, by which I take it to mean that the brain recapitulates within itself the structures, the associative, within its structure and function, the associative regularities that are out there in the world. But this raises a crucial question, which is how can the brain become a model of its world? Because we don't have direct access to the world. All we have are sensory inputs that tell us vague, ambiguous things about heat, light, force, chemical composition, as Vernon Mountcastle put it. It's a highly problematic process of inference that it must engage in to make sense, for a number of reasons. Firstly, the nature of the inference is an abductive inference, reasoning backwards from the data that we have to the inferred causes of those data in the external world. What objects out there caused our current sensations? The data come in huge quantities, and we have a limited capacity system. There's an inbuilt delay in neural transmission, and if we're not careful, if we're basing our understanding on our sensory inputs, we're actually living in the past. And there's an inherent ambiguity in all sensory signals. Claude Shannon, the information theorist, actually recognized the importance. He was dealing with the same problem, which is how to pass on information within a limited capacity system when that information is complex. And he recognized something crucial, that the information in the signal relates not just to the patterns in the signal, but to the expectations of the recipient. And this raises this notion that Robin touched on, which is the benefits of being a predictor of your world. And I want to take those three major problems, the intensity of the information, the delays in neural transmission, and the ambiguity in signal representation, and to show how prediction can optimize our inference in the face of those challenges. The notion of large quantities of information in a limited system was what was being dealt with by the telecommunications engineers, particularly in the Bell laboratories in the 50s, who had this challenge of transmitting very hefty images within a limited bandwidth and having to reconstruct them at the other end. And what they recognized early on is that within these images there is actually a huge amount of predictability and therefore redundancy. Rather than transmitting the absolute value of every pixel across the system, all you really need to do is recognize that any given pixel is very strongly predicted by its neighbors. And therefore, what's really needed is a system that transmits the newsworthy signal, the so-called prediction error, as it's come to be known. All of the information that you would really need is actually captured here. These are the mismatched signals. Interestingly, in a seminal paper in 1982, Srinivasan and colleagues pointed out that there's a similar system within the retina, where essentially, as well as our photoreceptors, bipolar cells, and then ganglion cells leading to the optic nerve, we have these horizontal cells which allow each cell to inhibit and be inhibited by its neighbor. So cells with similar levels of activity will actually cancel each other out, and the cells that differ from their neighbors will stand out. The newsworthy signal, the mismatch between what you would predict and what's the case, is what's passed forward. And this became known as predictive coding, which you will frequently come across. So the predicted-based system helps us deal with large quantities of information. What about the delays in the neural transmission? So I've borrowed here a thought experiment, back of the envelope type thought experiment from David Cox in Harvard. And the experiment is this. Imagine you're facing a serve from the amazing Serena Williams. You have about 400 milliseconds between the ball leaving her racket and coming into the immediate vicinity of your face. Now, it takes about 60 milliseconds for the neural signals to be transmitted from retina to primary visual cortex. To go to the higher visual areas, you're talking about 170 odd milliseconds, which means that by the time you see the ball, or that your actual sensation of the ball is somewhere around 9 meters behind where it actually is, which is bad news for your face, of course. And the idea is that you have to be a predictor. I generated this sort of catchy soundbite. It's not, I have some problems with it, but I think taking the idea that the sensation is history, but the perception is the prediction, is a useful way of thinking about how we deal with these delays. And we see it nicely in the flash lag illusion. So Rory, my charming assistant, if you wouldn't mind playing the first video, please. So this is just a highly predictable rotating bar with a constant angular momentum. The idea is that actually what you're perceiving there is the bar where it will be rather than where your senses are telling you that it is. And in order to show that, what you can do is add another bar extended from it, exactly in line with it, but to flash up that bar in an unpredictable way. So you can't capitalize on this ability to predict where the bar is. Now, the flash lag illusion suggests, it may not be that compelling in here, that the bar that's not predicted, even though it's in line, will actually be perceived as being slightly delayed because you're having to rely on sensation rather than prediction-based perception. So could we play the second one, please? So you'll see, I think, a subtle but fairly compelling perception of it lagging behind, even though it's actually in line. And if you could play the third one, please. So what I've done with the third one is just I've added the bar more frequently and in a more predictable way. Is the third one playable, please? The one on the right? Ah, yeah. So this is just making it slightly more predictable by extending the amount of time it's on the screen and making it appear more frequently, and the lag is attenuated. So finally, this notion of ambiguity in signal representation. Essentially, all sensory inputs could come from an absolute infinite array of possible external causes. It's an insoluble problem. At its very simplest, think of the flat image that we have in our retina could actually be from something that's very small and very close to something that's very big and very far away, and people have a lot of fun playing with these ideas and creating perspective. The images or the stimuli that we use to assess these phenomena are these black and white two-tone images, which are, if you haven't seen them before, although some of you may have, are largely indecipherable and ambiguous. However, if, like me, you've seen the template image from which they were taken, it becomes much easier to discern the hidden image merely on the basis of the prior knowledge that you now possess. Essentially, the image itself hasn't changed. It's identical sensory input. All that's changed is your prior expectation or your prior knowledge. And it makes it very easy to disambiguate, and this grows stronger and stronger as you move on. Christoph Teufel, my colleague, came up with a neat way of assessing the impact of this high-level knowledge of the content of the image on certain areas of the black and white image, by showing that, I don't want to go into details for reasons of time, by showing that your sensitivity, or the feature detector sensitivity in regions such as this, where there is no objective contour, but there's an implicit contour if you have prior knowledge, that the sensitivity of feature detectors there increases if and only if you have that prior knowledge. So this high-level knowledge is fundamentally changing sensitivity of low-level feature detectors in visual cortex. So the long and the short of that is predictions based on on spatial temporal correlations that are out there in the world and our past knowledge and experience of those enhance our efficiency of processing, improve our sensitivity, and help us to deal with this profound computational problem. But there's always a but, and that is that they confer upon us a tendency or a possibility of seeing or experiencing or comprehending what's not objectively there, which is, of course, the formal definition of a hallucination. Robin mentioned the Konica triangle. This is the example where you see a phantom white triangle that's not actually objectively there. Your system is assuming that there must be one to explain this array of shapes. Now, this raises a couple of interesting historical points that I just wanted to mention briefly. Firstly, this notion that the act of perception has a hallucinatory quality. It's doing the rounds a lot, the idea perception is controlled hallucination, and my postdoc, Johanna Feynman, traced that back to Hippolyte Taine, who in De l'Intelligence produced a really lovely, I've read it in translation, my French isn't up to it, but produced a really lovely description of nature of brain processes, including normal perception. He made the point we must call external perception true hallucination. Gurney and colleagues, writing another book that's freely downloadable and really fascinating writing. It's a survey of 700 people with varying psychopathologies in the 19th century. Made the point that illusions are merely the sprinkling of fragments of genuine hallucination. Now, I like this because I was always taught that we must be very careful to distinguish illusions from hallucinations, and I think our next speaker might put me right on this. But I like the idea that there's this strong link between the two things. So we have this problem that we want to use our predictions to optimize our inferences about the world, but if we do so, we have the chance that we are actually creating the world in the image of our own expectations. And we can see this balance. This is the essence of the balance that Robin drew out in predictive processing, that predictions will optimize sensitivity to signals in the context of noise or ambiguity, whereas prediction error will optimize sensitivity to the unpredicted. So we need to be sensitive to both, because if we over-rely on predictions, then we become insensitive to unpredicted signals. We become essentially stuck in our own expectations. Conversely, we risk over-flexible updating and a tendency to treat signal as noise if we're over-reliant on external signals and we don't bring to bear our predictions. We would essentially update and rewrite every time we had a new signal. And since we can never perfectly predict the world, there will always be prediction errors. Robin also mentioned the seminal paper by Rao and Ballard, and in it they essentially hypothesized this hierarchical system in which there's feedback predictions from knowledge systems and so forth, and feed-forward error signals. And I've redrawn that in a way that I find fairly intuitive to capture this idea of balance. And I just outlined briefly the key components. So we have our inputs with feed-forward error signals, which are essentially feeding forward everything that's not been predicted, and our predictions, which are essentially trying to balance those and render them unnecessary, if you like. So the system is trying to achieve this balance, and the overall aim is to minimize our prediction errors, which we can do by suppressing them, just ignoring them, as we often get in visual illusions, or we can update our predictions, learn about the world, change our beliefs about the world, or we can act upon the world in the way we sample it or in the way we fashion it. And I think, I'm not going to talk about that, but I think that's an absolutely key part of this system. It's about our agency and what we do to the world. So that this is very speculative. It's a toy, almost metaphorical model, and I think it's very important to remind ourselves of that. But one thing that I think we need to think about is having different sorts of predictions at different levels of the system. So as a sort of working heuristic. Maybe at the lower level we're talking about specific physical, concrete predictions about contours and shades and shapes and object properties and so forth. But at the higher level, we have everything that makes us us, our predictions about social situations, about abstract, general ideas about the world. And I think the system as a whole will work to minimize prediction errors. And this gives us now an opportunity to think about ways in which the system may go wrong. And I want to think about that in the context particularly of hallucinations. And this again is very speculative. So imagine we denude the system of an input, such as we might find in sensory deprivation or Charles-Bonnet syndrome. We would find an imbalance whereby we have, if you like, unbalanced predictions coming downwards. We have these predictions about shapes and contours and so forth, but we have no input to balance that out. The consequence would be that we might create those images as within our perceptual system merely by taking away the input. Interestingly, I think in a situation like this, the higher levels of the system would still be able to adapt in normal ways. And I think that might be one of the reasons why in Charles-Bonnet syndrome that people can acquire insight into the nature of the visual experiences that they have. They still have them and they can still be just as elaborate and vivid, but they can say, no, this is not real, this is not the world. Alternatively, we could think of a situation in which we have, through circumstance, through our own experience of the world, through trauma, through neglect that may be prolonged or it may be acute, but we change our prior expectations about how the world is and how people are. Maybe we learn that people are innately hostile towards us, aggressive towards us, do not have our best interests at heart. Such a change in priors would likely percolate down the system so that we started to create evidence in favor of it, such that we might interpret neutral facial expressions as being laden with sinister intent. We might see shapes where there are none. It could be that a high-level alteration in priors can fundamentally percolate down the system so that we resolve prediction errors as a whole, but in such a way that makes the world a sinister and unpleasant place. Alternatively, we can imagine a more pervasive deficit. So one idea that many have put forward is that in a condition such as schizophrenia, where there is thought to be a widespread alteration in message passing via altered synaptic processing, maybe we get upregulated dopamine, which gives an essentially strengthened upward signal, giving the sense that there are prediction errors no matter what we predict. The idea would be that these strong percolating bottom-up signals are telling us that our existing models of the world are wrong and need to be updated. A consequence of that would be that these priors that we have and have had for a long time could be rejected in favor of new and perhaps more expansive, more universal priors. And those in themselves, my animation's gone a bit funny, those in themselves could then generate a compensatory response where the system finds evidence in favor of the new priors. Again, a reinterpretation of facial expression or of neutral noises and so forth. Evidence in favor of this, I'm among friends here, let's be honest, there is not a huge amount of barn door evidence in favor of these metaphors, of these toy ideas. One instance of, there are some really great studies emerging. I've just got time to cover one from our group. Christoph Teufel led this and essentially did a simple experiment wherein he showed people these images, people with very early psychotic features and healthy controls. He showed them these images both before and after they'd seen the template. So in other words, the same sensory input before and after they had prior knowledge. The prediction he made, which I didn't believe, was that individuals prone to hallucination should show a greater top-down weighting and should actually show a relative advantage compared to controls when they're asked to try and discern the figures within these black and white images. And indeed, that's what was found. So if you look at the controls, before they've seen the template, they show a perceptual sensitivity or discrimination that's fairly low, as you would expect. After they've seen the template, this becomes significantly greater. In our hallucination-prone individuals, I mean, they had very early subtle psychotic features. There was a significant interaction such that their improvement as a consequence of prior knowledge was significantly greater than the one shown by controls. If you look at healthy controls and their scores on the Cardiff Anomalous Perception Scale, you see that they show the higher they score on this anomalous perception scale, the higher the performance benefit they get from having the top-down or the prior knowledge. Okay, so I'm coming to the end of time. Overall, I want to be very clear. This is a highly speculative model. There's very limited supportive evidence at the moment, and many aspects of the model are underdeveloped. The nature of predictions, for a start, I'm beginning to think that the mechanisms of different forms of prediction at different levels may well be different. But, and here's the sort of Pollyanna-ish bit, I do think it offers the promise of linking multiple levels of explanation. I think it can take us from the neural through the computational, the cognitive, the clinical, and potentially sociocultural. I think that's all wrapped up in this idea of the brain. I think it draws on our understanding of brain processes and links to them and puts us in touch with neuroscience, but I don't see it as being blindly reductionist. I don't think it assigns any sort of causal primacy to the brain, and rightly so. And finally, it takes the idea that the brain is a model of the world, which is so influential in my thinking, and that an individual's phenomenal experience can't be separated from their priors, from them as their whole world of experience. And it reminds us that if we're to say sensible, comprehensive things about the brain, we have to take into account the wider reality within which it's trying to make its way. And on that note, thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much for an absolutely fantastic conceptual introduction and some fascinating results in terms of hallucination. I'm aware of the time. I wonder if there's a chance for one question before we move on, and I'm sure Paul will be happy to answer questions if you catch him during the break. Gentleman down here.
I wonder whether you've extended your ideas to other conditions. In autism, for example, priors are incredibly important and the flexibility of prediction is very, very limited. Have you thought of your model in terms of conditions such as autism?
I have, and in fact, what I've done is kept up with the existing literature on application of hierarchical predicting processes to autism, and there have been some really interesting papers suggesting that one was titled "Seeing the World as Too Real," that weakened priors prevent one from actually suppressing sensory inputs and therefore having this sort of, essentially having an experience that this prediction-based system is always trying to suppress. So it's a great point, and I think there are other conditions to which it can be applied. I do sometimes get worried when a model applies quite so readily to so many things. And one of the flaws in this that I haven't had time to touch on, but which I'll mention now, is that there are a lot of there's a lot of imprecision in how we're using these models at the moment, and that's what we need to work on. But thanks for the comment. I guess that's it. Right. Thank you.